It is very good to have you with us today. It's a special treat to welcome to the TMC seminar Dr. Sunita Puri, who is Associate Professor of Medicine at the University of California, Irvine School of Medicine, where she directs the inpatient palliative care service. Dr. Puri is a 2025 Literature Fellow of the Bogliasco Foundation, and she's the author of That Good Night, Life and Medicine in the 11th Hour, which I've been reading. And I told her a few moments ago is delightfully insightful regarding and true to my own experience of learning how to care for people who face their own deaths, they and their families. I strongly recommend it to you. We'll be talking about that this hour. Dr. Puri is widely published. She writes not only in the medical literature, but in places like the New Yorker, Atlantic, New York Times, LA Times, Wall Street Journal, JAMA, etc. I encourage you to look up some of her writing. But we're really delighted to have her with us today. Dr. Puri, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Let's begin with just tell us a little bit of your story and how you ended up writing this book.
Yeah, so I was always somebody who was very fascinated with words and storytelling um, and the place of literature in the world, the capacity of literature to help people of very different backgrounds understand their commonalities across their visible or superficial differences. And I was a very big reader when I was a kid. I was a latchkey kid, daughter of very hardworking immigrants, and my mother is a physician as well. So um, writing stories and coming up with different worlds was very, very important to me. It was a place that I found refuge from loneliness, right? To be honest, as a child, in that family context. So I was always a writer at heart. And I think medicine and writing share something really important, which is the power of observation. We are
Mm,
always observing as physicians and as writers, what we are doing is observing the world to reinterpret it and to offer it in a slightly different form to a reader, always with the purpose of seeking the through line of human unity across difference. So it was always in my heart to be someone very concerned with words and language and the power of stories, both to unite and to divide. So when I went into medicine, I had already kind of written stuff that was mostly for myself in a lot of ways, but I started sending things out and always knew that I had a book in me. And I remember the day that I got my book deal and I was in clinic seeing a patient who I knew very well. Um, and I never leave the clinic for personal calls, but I saw that my agent was calling and I left the room and I came back in and this patient knew me really well and was like, "So what just happened?" And I usually don't talk about that sort of stuff with people, but I told her I got my first book deal and she just started crying because I think she knew
oh,
what it meant to me, even though it was not something that we ever directly talked about. So the book came about because I had been writing, had been sending pieces out, and knew very much that part of my service obligation in this world that I think God has given me is not just to see patients and to help patients and families and maybe some learners in the ivory tower of medicine, but also to take what I observe and see and make it known to other people in a very humble way as an offering. And I think of my writing very much as service. It's something that comes from God, in my opinion.
mm,
Um, and so writing this book was very much about what can I offer people that they're not going to get because they're not my patients. They're not maybe at that point. Their families are not at that point, but every human being is going to experience mortality. It is a given condition of what it means to be human. So what can I offer to help people along the way? And that's how the book and all of the other writing kind of came about. But I'm glad I'm talking in a theology seminar because I think this language of God and spirituality and obligations of service and being a servant to a higher power is not something I will generally talk about in
Mhm.
medicine. But that is very much how I think about my writing as an act of service to something bigger than myself.
You in the book, it's clear that you were formed um, to both to be aware of God and also formed to serve, or you at least saw a lot of service in your parents. I thought it was quite remarkable. Tell us a little bit about how your parents' witness, we might say, formed you in that posture regarding, I guess, the suffering of other people and your own work in response to it.
Yeah, so my parents are both immigrants from India, and they're both very, very deeply spiritual people. And belief in God in his varied forms really kind of is what got them. If you ask them about their life story, they will say it was nothing but the grace of God that got them from really terrible post-independence poverty and violence in newly independent India to the lives that they have now. And sometimes I get very emotional talking about this, so I
Mhm.
apologize to
All
everybody
right.
if I tear up a little bit, but I've seen where my parents come from, and it is pretty miraculous what they were able to do in terms of getting their educations. My mom's a physician and my father's an engineer. And at the time, those were the ways out of poverty. And basically, when I was growing up from a very young age, my parents taught me to revere God. Not so much, I think there's a lot of language of God fearing, but it was really more of God revering and seeing God in all people, in all forms of life. And this understanding that spirituality and science can actually sit together, that they're not these oppositional forces that I think we think of, that that's kind of assumed, I think, in a lot of cultural settings in the US, especially in medicine. I think, if God comes up, I remember as a resident, none of us really knew what to do. And we would be like, okay, do you want to talk to the chaplain? But how people think about spirituality and what's holy to them is a huge way to understand their lens on the world, their interpretation of their own suffering, the meaning of their suffering, the grappling with it. And that is the key to helping them make decisions that are really resonant with their worldview and how they understand things. So I was very lucky to grow up in a context where both my parents are deeply scientific, but they also have an appreciation of the mystery of things and the role of faith and understanding what it means to surrender and to accept, which are not things that we are taught at all in medicine.
Yeah. I want to come back to a couple of things you mentioned there, surrendering and accepting. Um, and I also want to come back to your parents and the witness of service and the story of Rajiv, who you tell, and the nursing home your parents would visit. But
Yes.
before I do that, since you raised this, as you noted, when patients mention language about God, it's characteristic that doctors just ignore it.
Yeah.
And I think often, not in bad faith or bad will, but just I don't know what to do with that. Um, Change the subject, or they'll say, "Well, do you want to talk to a chaplain?" Um, how do you how do you respond, and how do you, I guess, try to encourage your trainees to respond when a patient says, "Well, we're trusting the Lord," or "We're praying for a miracle," or so on?
Yeah. So, to me, I think something that's so beautiful about our field, Dr. Carlin, is this real emphasis on curiosity
Hmm.
rather than judgment. And to me, when somebody brings up that language, the thing I love to say is, tell me more about that. Help me understand what God means to you. And tell me about the role he has played in your life in difficulties up to this point. And tell me about what strength you derive from that. And that's just a way of understanding that person in the language and worldview that they find most resonant or most reflective of who they are. And I think when I hear people tell me, I'm waiting for a miracle, again, I think curiosity leads me in the direction of tell me what that looks like for you. What miracle are you hoping for? Just like if somebody says, I want everything done, my question is, tell me what that looks like to you. Because I think when I was a resident, for example, if I heard, I want everything done and I believe in God and I'm going to wait for a miracle, I think up in my training, we didn't know, as we talked about earlier, how to like really engage with that. So I would just assume you want everything done. I'm going to do everything. I'm going to put you through CPR. I'm going to put you on this dialysis machine without understanding what they were actually asking for or hoping for, and certainly without my ability to give them guidance. Like, we are doing the things you're hoping for, and unfortunately, he is still dying. And I try to model that for my trainees and to tell them, like, regardless of our beliefs or non-beliefs, this is about curiosity about the person in front of you. So it doesn't have to be spirituality or bust, right? Or cold scientific language. It is really about trying to understand the meaning behind the words that people are saying to you, because unless we know what they're saying and where they're coming from, we're going to project our assumptions onto that and potentially really harm them. Like, I, for sure, and I'm pretty open about this in the book and other pieces I've written, that my own shortcomings in being able to navigate these conversations, I know they caused harm. And I didn't
Mhm.
know any better, right? And so I have compassion for the patients and I have compassion for who I was at the time, that I simply wasn't taught. And I try to tell my trainees, like, I am hoping to spare you dealing with some of the aftermath that I have had to deal with. And I don't think that ever goes away for sensitive souls, and like I'm definitely a very sensitive soul. So I still think about the people who I would, if I could go back in time, I would have those conversations differently.
Yeah. I am struck that the language about waiting on a miracle or um, is is often more a statement of we're going to do our part to keep faith here with our loved one
Yeah.
than it is an insistence that everything be done. Um, and
Yes.
just until you're curious and ask the question, it's hard to learn that as a doctor.
Yep, I think that's a great point, that how we are hearing and interpreting what others are saying, we're interpreting that through the lens that we have about what are we supposed to do for this person, rather than, as you're saying, really interpreting that as a statement of standing with someone that a family loves.
I want to circle back to your parents. I mean, they obviously, as you said, taught you to recognize the mystery and cultivated a God consciousness in you.
Yeah.
They also essential to their own spiritual practices was um, trying to reach out to people who are in hurting around them.
Yeah.
And you tell the story of a young man of your parents visiting a nursing home, which sounds like what a lot of people worry a nursing home is like. The
Yes.
smells and people abandoned seemingly often, um, and tell us a little bit of that story and what you learned from your father in your conversation about it.
Yep. So my parents, had my brother and I, in the context of our spiritual community, do a lot of community service. And the concept, the idea that we say in our community is that work is worship, and that service is worshiping your fellow man because God exists equally in all of us. And so service to others is service to God. And so we would make like sandwiches for the homeless every Sunday. And my parents, they didn't let me do this, come along when I was very young, but they would go to like Skid Row, downtown LA, and distribute these things. In the winter, the community would pitch in to buy blankets for homeless people in downtown. And occasionally, as I got older, I could come along for that and actually see what it was that my parents thought was so intolerable and despicable, which was the gravity of poverty and abandonment and homelessness in a rich country. This was kind of their everyday in India, but here I think they really struggled with seeing people out on the road like that. So those were the sorts of things that my brother and I just kind of grew up doing. And as part of this, my parents would go to a nursing home, um, and visit with residents, bring Christmas presents, bring me along. I would play piano in the nursing home, and I found it really upsetting and overwhelming, and I did not like going there because you see dying and you see decay and you see extreme loneliness, people with dementia who are talking to themselves. And I was, I was like ages 10 through 18. And when I was 10, I really was frightened by people talking to themselves and not knowing what that was about. The smells of the nursing home, the kind of deep sense of like these people have been relegated at the end of their lives to this space where they don't even know what's going on. So I really did not like going there, I'll just be honest. And my dad somehow one day met an Indian gentleman who was there, an older guy who was older than my dad. And I think, again, at the time where there weren't many Indians in that community, I observed how my dad especially would go out of his way to say hello to anybody who was Indian. And this might be hard to understand, but and I picked this up from my dad, you can kind of tell where in India somebody is from. And so my dad knew that this man was Punjabi. And he went up and started talking to him, and the look on this guy, so he just started crying to be seen and recognized in a place where there were like no Indians in this nursing home. And his son had suffered this horrible car accident where he was left with a traumatic brain injury and was really cognitively not so much there. He would wake up and kind of babble, but that was about it. And this man and his wife, who were both elderly, were there every day at his bedside, taking care of their son. And their son's wife and children had left. It was just a really horrible situation. And they were very faith-based and would tell my dad, God is going to bring our son back. And my dad knew that the likelihood of that was extraordinarily low, but he still went there and sat with this man and his wife. And this man used to call our house, and he would only say, like in Hindi on the phone, like, child, I am. And then he gave his name. And I would find it really awkward picking up the phone because I did not know what to say to him. And I would very quickly hand the phone to my dad. And my dad, I asked him, I was like, why are you hanging out with, like, this is so depressing. And he said, there is so much in life that you're not going to be able to fix. And being with people in their suffering is also what God wants us to do for each other. And so from him, I just learned what it means to just be in a situation that you cannot fix with pain that is really palpable. This is another story where I get emotional thinking about it
Mm.
because of the love and devotion of these parents to their son, and to my dad's commitment to putting himself in a situation that was upsetting, but it was a necessary type of witnessing. And I think we're really bad at that as humans, to just be with someone else's suffering that you know you can't fix. But there's something about choosing to be in a situation that is beyond you that is holy to me.
I will tell you, I got choked up reading about your dad there in that conversation. And um, one of our teachers here at Duke Divinity School, Stanley Hauerwas, wrote decades ago um, a piece in which he talked about how the heart of medicine, he argued, is the habit of being present to those who are suffering.
Yeah.
And as he put it, these are my words, that we witnessing to the fact that we are not going to abandon someone just because they are assigned to us of our own mortality and all that we can't control and all the suffering that is around us. And he ends up saying, to form people capable of that when it's really hard to be around that, as you experienced, we kind of recoil. Um, he says you need something like a church. And I'll
Yeah.
say, reading your story, it seemed to me your parents were uh, what they were doing was something like it was something like what Stanley was saying was necessary to form you
Yeah.
to to be able to show up and know that you got to stick in there and be present to suffering even when you can't fix it. And you end up saying, I think, something like that in the book, that we're say more about that, how in medicine we're sort of anxious to do something to be helpful, but you came to see we often needed to be still.
Yes. So I had a really wonderful mentor in med school. We had very little exposure to palliative care, death and dying, like none of that. And that was not that long ago. And I'm glad things are moving, not as fast as I wish, as I bet you and I wish they would. But this guy was a geriatrician and did a lot of ethics work and was very into the humanities. And I remember one day he was telling me, I'll never forget this. He said, you know that saying, don't just stand there, do something. Well, I want you to think about the opposite. Don't just do something, stand there. And I found that so profound. It was like a huge light bulb went
Mm,
off that I had never considered in the context of your medical training, where you're taught death is your fault, not suffering incidentally, but dying is your responsibility. Like you've done something wrong if someone dies. You need to be quick on your feet, master things, do something like do. And when his name is Guy Miko, and when he said that to me, I just remember thinking, wow, like how come no one has told me that before in the context of my medical training? And this kind of idea of being still and witnessing and really seeing, Dr. Curlin, I kind of think that so much human suffering in general just comes from not being seen or heard or understood. Like, I think that those three things are what we owe each other or what we can offer each other as a real act of love. And so, if you put that into a context where people are sick and scared, to just say to them, I see you, I see how much you're suffering, that is healing, I think, for people.
mm.
And we draw into this binary of curing or not curing, but healing is always possible. I think that's where people turn to faith for. I think that's where people find comfort in God and spirituality, is that healing, like when my Christian patients talk about going to heaven, of having a whole healed body, like we talk about what healing means beyond the curing of the physical form. And it's only when you can really not just do something, but stand there and be okay in the stillness and the slowness, that you can help people to heal regardless of cure.
Um, I want to go back to the surrendering challenge. Your book is titled That Good Night. That's the first part of the title, which alludes to Dylan Thomas's famous poem in which he repeats the phrases, do not go gentle into that good night, and the second phrase, rage, rage against the dying of the light. And your book is kind of a exploration with, I guess, observing the raging and what it looks like to go gently. And so, what do you make of those phrases in light of your experience as a paladin medicine doc?
I think in our country and in increasingly in others, there is this idea that if you are sick, you need to fight this. And we have these like ideas of fighting or giving up, battling a cancer, especially in the world of cancer, because of, I think, historically, the way that the war on cancer was framed, I think, by Nixon. And so we have this battle language, this language of ferocity. And that's, I think, where some of these tropes that Dylan Thomas wrote about a long time ago still have a life of their own. That gentleness is somehow, it can't be a part of that binary. You can't be wanting to go for cure, but still experience gentleness in that process. It's either you're a warrior or you're giving up. And I think, unfortunately, what I've seen is that, like, I'm very allergic to binaries, right? Good, bad, or good and evil. Like, I think there's a lot of, we miss a lot of nuance and we miss a lot of human experience when we fall into those binaries. Like, either you're grieving or you've healed. I mean, I even think the notion of what it means to heal, the idea that grief has an endpoint, the idea that healing has an endpoint, I think these are false narratives that we impose onto people's experience that are very limiting because they're not true to the nuance of what it means to be human. So I've seen a lot of people tell me that they're going to fight this, they have a lot to live for. And to me, what I'm always curious about, again, exploring the language, tell me what being a fighter means to you. What if it is true that you, as a spirit, as a human, are a fighter, but your body can't fight anymore? Can we explore the difference between who you are and the limits of biology? And that, to me, I try to teach this to my trainees, that kind of trying to separate the human from the physical form, which is, again, I think, veering into some realms of spirituality, that can really get at this idea of like, what about gentleness? What about self-forgiveness is missing from these narratives when we're talking about, I'm going to go down in a blaze of glory? Is that glory? Do you have to be on fire to experience glory? Like, tell me about that. And I think when people have a sense or they're given permission to really say, I'm not sure that I want to go down in a blaze of glory. I don't know that that's what's best for me. And I don't know that's how I want my family to remember me. Then you give them permission to step away from these narratives and really talk about what's true for them. I've found it very freeing for some people to help them understand there's not one way to die, right?
Mm.
You have options. There's not one way to live, and there is not one way to die. And how we live often influences how we think about dying, but it doesn't have to be absolute. Just because you have fought through things before in different contexts, that might have given you more benefit than harm. But what about in this context? And I think this is again where writing and narrative really help me in this work, because I want people to tell me in their own terms, what is the story that has led to this point? And then my job is to take what I'm hearing and help them understand that we make decisions in a context. Can I help you understand the context of this particular fight versus the fights you've been through before? And maybe if I do my job of setting the scene, the character is going to respond differently than they thought they would,
Mhm.
because they're open to new possibilities and a new understanding.
That's beautifully put. It seems to me there's in it a form of the kind of clinical reasoning that is really essential to medicine, if medicine is going to be more than just following algorithms and, processing people through a system. We have to discern, or just satisfying patients' wishes. We have to
Yes,
discern what is the good that's possible that we can pursue together.
yes.
Um, I'm kind of curious. Um, it seems to me our field has internalized the notion that we are to listen to the patient's stories and the patient's goals, and then let the structure of their story and their goals be our guide. And I'll just say, I'm uncomfortable with how far that seems to go, insofar as it
Yes.
seems to suggest whatever story the patient says is theirs, is the right story, and we're to help them toward the end that they see that they're after. And it obviously comes to a head in some of the ethically challenging things that palliative medicine docs face, like when patients want to stop eating and drinking and want our help, or in
Yeah.
places like California when they want to opt for physician-assisted suicide or medical aid in dying. Um, how do you think about that?
So I think this kind of frame of what is medicine's obligation to patients is a really important place to start with answering that question, because I think somewhere along the way we have been socialized to believe that whatever a patient wants is what we do. Like that is our job. And I disagree with that because I think that when we just offer a menu of options and have them choose and go with that, we're abdicating our responsibility to paint the context in which these decisions are being made. So, something I'll tell my trainees, like, let's talk about a ventilator, right? It's a technology. If someone's in a car accident, otherwise young and healthy, needs to be on a vent for a little bit,
No
there's
brainer.
it's a bridge from a bad place to a place of healing.
Mm.
You take the same technology, and now we're talking about somebody with end-stage pancreatic cancer and gram-negative rod sepsis in the ICU. It's the same technology, but the context is completely different. So we can't ask a cookie cutter question of, if you couldn't breathe, would you want us to put you on a ventilator? In those two different contexts, it means completely different things to be on a ventilator. One can really enable a return to a reasonable quality of life, and one veers into the territory of prolonging death. And
Mm.
so when I think about how we talk about what patients would like, what I try to teach folks is that autonomy has no place if beneficence and non-maleficence are not considered beforehand. Meaning, what are we offering? What is reasonable to offer in a given clinical situation? And I'm sure you've gone through this too, where I'll get a lot of consults where the teams will call and say, we need your help with goals of care. And really what's happened is they've offered something that they wished that that family or patient would not have chosen.
Oh, yeah.
My question to them is, why did you offer this? Tell me what the reasoning is here. Because if you've had 5 conversations hoping someone's going to make a different decision, but you haven't explained the context, I mean, I don't know about you, Dr. Curlin, but sometimes I feel like I'm a cleanup crew. We're
Yeah.
trying to undo a bad framing about the intent of medicine from the beginning of this patient situation. So I think when we take that frame and think about decisions like physician-assisted death, the thing that I always come back to again is curiosity, and tell me what you're hoping for. Tell me what relief this is going to bring to you, because sometimes, and I've actually, when I was at USC, I wrote our institutional policy on physician-assisted death when the law came out in California in 2016. And I wrote in that everyone looking to do this has to have a palliative care consult, because there's so often that what people are hoping for, that the relief death will bring, is actually that a lot of their suffering hasn't been addressed. I've
Mm.
had people who have been in excruciating pain and never had that controlled. And so once that's under control, they might still want to go through the process, but I found very few people actually use the medications at the end of life. They wanted it there in case things became really bad. But there too, I can honor what they're hoping for as long as it's informed. But if it's just, I want this and you need to give it to me, and there's no real attempt at exploration, that's where I think medicine falls apart and does a disservice to people. We always have to understand where people are coming from when they're talking about end of life and suffering, no matter what they're asking for. And Also, I'll give you a totally different example. I had somebody who was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer, hormone positive, who was referred to me because oncology says she doesn't want treatment, she wants hospice. And I explored it with her because this is metastatic breast cancer is not the same as metastatic cholangiocarcinoma. And what she actually told me, the reason that she didn't want treatment was because she had a friend who died of cholangiocarcinoma. And she
Wow.
thinks that that chemo ruined her friend's life. So my role was to talk about the differences between what oncology was going to offer her versus what happened to her friend. And in the end, let it be known, I referred this patient back to oncology because once I actually got into the weeds with her, I could see that her decision making was not necessarily informed on facts. It was informed by fear. And that's okay. That's very human. But if I had just said, okay, let's talk about hospice, I would have missed a very crucial element in her decision making that helped me to guide her differently. So I
Do
think,
you,
oh, go ahead.
well, yeah, do you sometimes find yourself, and I do, but I'm kind of curious how you think about this, not just um, posing important things that patients might consider and asking how they think about that, but encouraging them to reconsider, to let go of something they think is their best way, because all things considered, even having heard them, I don't think they're thinking about it as fully as they would be if they're being fully reasonable, and trying to encourage them to pursue a course of action that seems, given my experience, it seems a more fitting approach. How do you think about that kind of influence, maybe the dangers of it, or yeah, your thoughts on that?
So I think we've gone, again, to go back to binaries, there's this idea of either we honor autonomy, and if we don't, we're paternalistic. And I think that there's a real fear of coming off as paternalistic or coming off as like, I know bad, doctor knows best, right? But I think when we are so, number one, I think something I'm trying to work on in my own life is really interrogating how much fear drives my decisions in my life, but also in my counseling of patients and asking, like, what am I so afraid of? Is this based in reality or is this based in some vestige of something that happened 10 years ago? So, in general, I think thinking about why are we afraid to come off as maybe knowing best based on our years of experience. And an example I'll give you is CPR, which is something that I think about a lot and I've written about quite a bit because it is such a great example of us not being willing to say and to be strong about saying, I have an ethical duty not to extend your death in this violent way. And I don't always say it like that,
Mhm.
but I do talk about the history of CPR, its invention, who it was meant for, and how we think about whether there's something reversible going on or not. And I used to be very afraid of saying, like, I hear that you want it, but I'm not offering it. And here's why. And like, just like we can say you're not a surgical candidate or you're too fragile to get chemotherapy, we have a hard time transposing that logic into CPR or onto the discussions about CPR. And so I think kind of what I think you're getting at is how do you balance wanting to help people reconsider what they've taken as truth or gospel in their particular situation. And I think that's where gently leading them to the point where we can validate where they're coming from. And sometimes I'm pretty like straightforward and honest in my conversations. So I'll be like, you know what, Mr. Smith, I have a thought that I want to share with you, and I fear that it's going to come off, or you might hear it in a way I don't intend. So I'd like to share my thought and then make sure that we're on the same page about where I'm coming from. So you validate, but you also challenge. And I think challenging is part of our role. I think thinking very deeply about the options we put on the table for somebody is part of our role because they are not textbook questions. We are not just saying, okay, the person's in renal failure, let's dialyze them. To what end? If they have end stage cancer in the ICU, where is dialysis going to take them?
Right.
Is it going to restore their life? And sometimes I'll say about CPR, this is about reversing death. And reversing a death is not the same as restoring a life. And that's where I'm coming from. And I think if we can appeal to people as a human, like meld our humanity with our professional experience, in my experience, people tend to experience that as an act of care rather than
Mm.
an act of judgment of I know better than you.
I, Let me pick up with that, and this might end up being our last question, depending on how it goes. But in the beginning, very beginning of your book, I think it's actually in the intro, you write, "My work in the borderland between life and death has shown me how we, doctors, patients, families, talk around rather than about suffering, dignity, living, and dying. We rely on euphemism, silence, and jargon when we most acutely need to be clear and articulate." Then in the first chapter, you describe someone who I just smiled at the description immediately, Dr. McCormick, who seemed to buck that trend. He seemed to show a different way.
Yeah.
And I just curious if you'd say a little about what you learned from watching Dr. McCormick.
Yeah. So I gave everyone pseudonyms, but Dr. McCormick is BJ Miller, who was
Ah, is it? Okay.
I just outed
For
my
those who don't know, BJ Miller is a very, very well-known palliative medicine doc. Go ahead. Yeah, keep
and he's
continue.
very unassuming. And that was like the first time I saw a doctor talk to a patient as though they were a friend. And
Mm.
I always tell BJ when I talk to him that I totally imprinted on him like a little duckling. Like he always says my friend to people, and I now always say my friend to people and my patients. But I just saw him talk to somebody, to Donna, who was the patient in that chapter, about dying of renal failure in a way that was very honest and straightforward and did not feel to me like a transgression or like, ooh, we're going to scare this person. It just felt to me like what needed to be said in a very humane way. And it really kind of taught me that honesty and being honest is compassion. Talking around the truth and hiding behind our language that only doctors understand was not really a way to do justice to the human experience of dying. And dying is not a medical event. It's a spiritual event. It's a transition that has emotional and cultural and religious underpinnings and tonalities. And BJ really kind of modeled that for me just by being himself. And I encourage my trainees, bring that sense of human authenticity to your interactions, whether you're talking about putting a central line in somebody or talking about what they want for themselves if time is short. Like, just talk to them as if you would talk to a friend, because at the end of the day, we are all going to walk that road and we all want honesty. No one wants to be sold false hope. And I think sometimes when we talk in technical language, we are peddling false hope. Because we're not being honest with people in a way they can understand. Another of my mentors, the writer Katie Butler, always talks about kitchen table language.
Hmm.
Talk to people as you would around a dinner table. And I think one of the things I had to unlearn in palliative care fellowship was this kind of hiding behind technical jargon. Because when we say to people, you have multi-system organ failure and you can't protect your airway, okay, versus your father or sister or husband or whoever, her heart, lungs, and kidneys are all not working and need incredibly aggressive forms of life support. Her body needs us to do its work. And that means that she is dying despite our best efforts. And to say something like that, where people can't There's only one way really to interpret that, that we need machines need to do the work of three organ systems.
Mm.
Underlying reason this happened is not fixable. So we need to talk about her suffering and what we're really doing for her at this point. That's very different than she can't protect her airways, so we need to intubate her.
Yeah. It seems to me that this challenge of being truthful in our speech, it's both, and interestingly, a number of Christian figures have talked about the importance of being truthful with one another as a condition for the possibility of a genuine community,
Hmm.
genuine solidarity, genuine trust. And it's hard. And to read was to revisit how hard it is even now. And there's a point in a different story, different patient, where you're talking to, I think, someone pseudonym, Dr. Jackson from the ICU calling you, and you're writing something on the phone to a colleague there, going, "What are they doing?" And it like captured how even there I'm guessing you would say, if you're your best self, you would tell Dr. Jackson, "I'm finding myself asking the question, what are you doing to this guy?" You know what I mean? And I just wonder if you'd speak to that.
Yeah, so I got
Because we
no,
don't we don't tell each other directly, you guys need to stop doing this, as best I can tell. Help me understand why you're doing this. It doesn't make sense to me.
yep. And I think as time has gone on, I've just become bolder about asking that. Like I'll joke with, one of my colleagues that sometimes I think we can feel like the attending of all attendings because there's like five teams involved in somebody's care. One team wants to do this, one team thinks this, and I feel like we have to be above it all and say, so let's step back, everybody, and tell me what you're hoping this intervention is going to lead to. Tell me how you're hearing that nephrology has this opinion, but you as cardiology think very differently. Like before we go into a meeting, we need to be reconciled. So I sometimes feel like I'm the attending of attendings, trying to get everybody to spell out what is their lens on this situation, kind of like we do with patients. Like, tell me how you understand what's happening to you. The way they explain it is a huge insight into how they're seeing the entire situation. And so I have become just a lot more straightforward about asking my colleagues to tell me why are they offering this? I don't say it quite like that, but I'll say, okay, so here's what I'm hearing from everybody about what we all agree on about this patient, and here's the point of disagreement. So, in this point of disagreement, you want to offer dialysis, or you think this person needs a defibrillator, whatever it is. Like, given what we agree on, how is path A or path B around this disagreement going to lead this patient where we think he wants to go,
Mm.
or where we think it's reasonable for him to end up, given what we all know? And so it's almost like being kind of an ethics consultant. And when I've done ethics consults, this is kind of what I'm trying to get at is what are you hoping for? And how do you see what you're offering as mediating that? And do you understand what they're hoping for? Another thing that'll commonly happen is, oncology in particular might offer something to people and say, in this study, we saw that somebody lived 4.72 months longer with this intervention. And my question to them is always, so like, who was in that study? What was their functional status? Would Mr. Smith have been included in this study? Usually not. So how can we really extrapolate the results of that study to this person? And I will challenge them because I think that's my role. I think it's also me trying to help them be clear about whether we're offering something because we can or because we should. And
Mm.
they challenge me too, and I love it. I think this is really important, and I'm not afraid of being challenged or having somebody be in conflict with me respectfully because this is not about me. It's also not about them. It's about the patient. And I think by guiding our colleagues and gently challenging them or inviting them to explain where they're coming from, I think that's an act of advocacy for people, for everyone involved. It's also a chance for them to say, yeah, I feel like I should offer this, but honestly, I don't want to. Then we explore that. Where's that coming from? Because we've all been in the situation where something is offered and we hope that person is not going to choose it. So I'll ask them, are you offering the defibrillator, but it's some part of you secretly hoping they're going to say no? 9 times out of 10, the answer is yes. So I say, so that's important. So why are we offering this?
Yeah. And if you think that you don't, even though you don't recommend it, you think you're obligated to put it on the table, will you tell them, I hope you don't choose this because I don't think it's a good idea in so many words?
Yep,
Um, and then will you be willing if you put it on the table and they say, I want that, to let it go without, trying to manipulate them further?
exactly.
Friends, Dr. Puri has another meeting here starting in just moments. She's been generous with her time.
I can take a few more minutes. I'm just going to
Okay.
text
Okay.
them and be like, I'm going to be a few minutes late. Give me
Okay.
1 second.
All right. Well, if anyone has a question you want to put to her, we may be able to take a couple of those. Um, uh, there was a comment from one of our guests that he had used these same words of Dylan Thomas as part of the eulogy at his father's funeral. And as a recovering surgeon, now for 15 years, a palliative care physician and Anglican priest, I have finally learned the value of silent presence and therapeutic healing relationships. Does speak also to how uh, hard it is to learn, lifelong, to learn this
Yes,
ability to be still and be present and tell the truth.
absolutely. Yep. These are acts of courage. I really
Yeah.
think they're acts of moral courage to be silent in someone else's suffering, to refrain from saying it's going to be okay, to understand that what we may want to say is more about us than what another person might need. And even being humble enough to say, and I've done certainly done this, that I can feel your pain reverberating in this room. How
Wow.
can I support you? Tell me what I can do.
Mm.
And I think just again, I try to teach my trainees that this is about like 95% of doctoring is an inside job. It's about understanding what you're uncomfortable with because what you're uncomfortable with is going to have it has its own magnetism in a room that people can pick up on that.
Mm.
So interrogating yourself and saying, what was it about that that didn't go well? How can I do it different next time? What was my contribution to how it didn't go well? And this is lifelong. Like the person who offered that comment said, and like you're saying, is I don't consider myself some great guru and expert on all of this. I'm constantly learning.
Yeah. I let's see, one more here. I think. Um, one more question, which is what sustained you when the experience of a patient does not go well, or in the face of extreme suffering that you just can't, you don't have the tools to relieve?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some pretty awful, awful things that like no amount of symptom management is touching, or just like extreme sorrow and grief that like you kind of absorb in a bodily way and take home with you. Like sometimes I come home and I'm like, I feel like I gained 15 pounds today, but it's literally just being swollen with other people's energy and sorrow. And I think what sustains me is this idea that everything is temporary. There's only one permanent thing in the world, and I think that is God. That universal consciousness is the only thing that will never change, but people's
Mm.
sorrow is going to pass, just like their joy, just like my own sorrow and joy. And I think understanding the value of impermanence has really helped me. It is very hard. And again, I am no great guru of all of this, But
if I can ask, do you encourage your trainees to think about that?
I do. I tell them because they'll hear me do it in family meetings, like talking about what lasts and what doesn't. And I often use examples from nature with people. Like we see the clouds passing in the sky, but the sky is not changing. It's always there. But everything we experience in a human life is like a cloud. Or if you look at a tree, I was just in Vancouver last week to give a talk and I was stunned by the foliage. I mean, it was like I've lived on the East Coast. This is some other realm of like these trees look like they're on fire. It was so
Yeah.
beautiful. And I stood beneath one of these trees and it was raining. And this tree was kind of shielding me from some of the rain. And I was just looking at it. People probably thought I was like on drugs or something. I was just like staring at the tree, not moving. And the reason I was doing that is because I so often cite the falling of the leaves as like that tree is still going to stand there, but everything on it is impermanent and subject to change. But these trees are beautiful. But what's happening is that these leaves are dying, right? This is death, but beauty and death can coexist. And I'll
Mm,
use that example with people. And so the trainees are hearing this. I don't know how much of it everybody is absorbing and using, but I'm very intentional about talking about impermanence with people because I think that's like, forget medicine, that's the rule of life. And Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk who has, I think, written with great clarity about this subject, has said impermanence is not what makes people suffer. It's wanting things to be permanent when they are not.
mm,
And I love those lines. And I think, again, like offering people solace sometimes means naming things that are not even particularly religious, they're just the facts. But they are the facts that can inform a spiritual reflection on life and what our suffering means and what our joy means.
mm. They can make possible a reckoning with the truth, including the truth of our impermanence. I think that's a good spot for us to wrap up. Dr. Puri, thank you so much. Again, friends, I encourage you to read the book, That Good Night. It's really terrific, beautifully written. And again, if you particularly take care of people who are dying, I think you'll find it both accurately describes and helps you see better your own experiences and make sense of them. So thank you. And we'll see you all next time.
Thanks, everybody.